Welcome to the Rock is George podcast. I'm your host, George Dionne, and this is episode 150. I want to thank you all for listening, and I want to thank you for getting to this landmark episode of 150. I couldn't have done it without you, the listeners, without the artists, without the PR guys, without the labels, or without the loudest.com on the planet, knac.com. Once again, I thank you all, and I look forward to 150 more episodes. And I hope you do too. My guest for this episode is solo artist and vocalist for WANG CHUNG, Jack Hughes. Jack has a brand new single out now, streaming on YouTube. It's called Since 2017. In 2021, Jack Hughes released his solo album Electro Acoustic Works 2020, just 1 year after releasing Primitive, which marked his first solo album in decades. Jack also has another side project called Jack Hues and the Quartet, which leans more towards folk, jazz, and jam band material. They released Epigonal Quark in 2022. It's a live recording from London in 2019. And of course, he still sings for WANG CHUNG, who's currently out on the Lost 80s live tour, which is an annual event. I had the chance to catch up with Jack Hughes on his downtime from the tour to speak about his latest single, his recent solo albums, his future solo work, what's going on with WANG CHUNG, and what to expect next year from the iconic new wave band. So here's Jack Hughes. Well, Jack, you're mainly known the world about as the singer of WANG CHUNG, but over the last few years, you've had quite a bit of solo output. So I want to talk a little bit about your solo career before we get into WANG CHUNG. And if I knew absolutely nothing about your solo music, how would you describe the sound to me?
Good question. I think it's always difficult for the artist to qualify what he's doing. But let's say that in the UK, there's a magazine called Prog Magazine, which supports progressive rock, basically. And they've been very supportive of what I've been doing. So I guess it's somewhere between, I mean, if you know WANG CHUNG, you'll know my voice. You know, that's a sort of a carry through. And it's not like the music's totally obscure or anything, but it is probably a little more extended than the WANG CHUNG stuff you're familiar with, and deals with some probably more sort of slightly darker themes, you know.
You have a single out now on YouTube called Since 2017. I believe this deals with UFOs or unidentified aerial phenomenon. So what brought about the composing of this song?
Well, the beginning of the year, I had a sort of rush of inspiration, for want of a better word. I wrote sort of 5 or 6 songs. This is not something you will, particularly if suddenly it just starts coming out, you know. And so I was sort of working on these different things. And I've been fascinated with the UFO subject since the late 90s, really, I suppose, you know. And when I started writing these songs, I had this sort of, you know, that as always begins with a sort of idea on guitar, you know. It just started, again, my writing process, if people sort of say, you know, how do you do it? It's not that I will things or decide things. It's like you have all these bits floating around in sort of orbit around some kind of gravitational force, and gradually the gravitation pulls them to a place, and the ideas started to float around since, you know, well, 2017 is basically in December. There was an article in the New York Times which sort of marked a bit of a turning point in the subject, from it being very fringe and sort of woo to being a little more socially acceptable, if not scientifically acceptable, you know. And I was watching a lot of stuff around that time, particularly a movie by James Fox called The Phenomenon, which I recommend anybody who's even vaguely interested in the subject to watch. And the song started to coalesce around these ideas. and then releasing it as a single was really to do with the congressional hearings that happened just a couple of weeks ago. And I thought, now's the time this song needs to be out in the world. You know, there's no particular rhyme or reason for it, but a friend of mine said, yeah, just like Neil Young, just release a single. You know, so that's what I did. Really, I'm not even sure it's completely finished in its form, you know, but it will become part of the next solo album, which will be our solo album number 3.
So this single leads to another solo album. Do you have yourself a timetable that you're going to put out this next solo album, or are you just going to drop singles along the way?
Well, actually, the way people listen to, or the way they consume music these days, I think dropping singles is actually quite a good way to do it. You know, I'm not sure that people have the time anymore to listen to complete albums. But having said that, I'm a huge believer in the album as a way that an artist really is able to express themselves. You know, so my first solo album was in fact a double album, which requires a lot of your time. And but I always loved that. You know, when I was growing up, you know, I guess I hit that sort of 14, 15, you know, when you're really susceptible to the power of music. Albums like Electric Ladyland and Cream's Wheels of Fire, the Beatles' White Album, these amazing double albums all sort of totally captivated me. So I'd always wanted to make a double album, you know, which gives you that extra scope somehow to sort of take your listener on a real journey. And I think Primitif works as a double album. It works as a complete listen through, even though it's pretty exhausting by the end of it, I think.
Well, you know, the album is kind of making a resurgence with vinyl making a comeback. I think it's geared towards people more you and our age, as far as that's concerned. But it's sort of making that comeback because people want to remember that holding something and seeing something and hearing something all at once.
Well, the physical presence of these things is very important, I think, you know. In fact, so I've done the 2 solo albums. Last year, I released one of my jazz albums, you know, for want of a better word. So I have my solo career, which is essentially me noodling away at home in my studio. You know, I work with some other musicians with drums and certain other stuff, you know, but a lot of it I do myself, you know. Yeah, and then a parallel sort of course is working with these jazz musicians who I've known since the early 2000s, really, you know, and we developed a project and released albums, you know, sort of file under jazz, you know, but I'm not sure that proper serious jazz musicians would call it that. But the closest I ever got was probably this live album that I released back in October 2022, I think it was, so last year. And but again, that's a double album. And I decided to make a sort of limited edition, really, of 500 copies. Each one's numbered and signed, and make it more like a kind of a sort of art piece in a sense, you know, because I think there's this tension between music, which is something you consume very quickly, and you know, the model for music has always been making millions of copies and selling those, you know. But now that's sort of changed. You know, and in a way, we're more into the NFT kind of area, where it's about scarcity, you know, and actually owning one of these things is something to prize, you know, as opposed to it being more disposable. So I was toying around with that sort of idea as well.
So the jazz project you're talking about is Jack Hughes and the Quartet, and the name of the album is Epigonal Quark, that came out in 2022. I love the live recording. It's jazz inspired for sure, jam band kind of stuff going on in there. And I assume this is a project that you're running concurrent with the stuff you're doing solo. It
is, yeah. Wang Chung days, you know, I was not into jazz at all, really. I remember Peter Wolf, who produced Everybody Had Fun Tonight, talking to me about Miles Davis, because Peter had played in Frank Zappa's band. And a lot of the musicians in Frank's band were also in Miles's band. They were the 2 schools that you went through after you'd been to Berkeley or that sort of stuff, you know. And I sort of said to Peter, well, I don't really know Miles Davis stuff, which I didn't at the time. And he was like, what? You know, and he sort of grabbed me. We went out for a drive in his car in his big Merc, and he played me Nefertiti, which is a Miles track from the sort of mid-60s. And I liked it. You know, you could not like that track. You could not sort of ignore it, kind of thing. But I didn't love it, if you know what I mean. And I remember buying the album and listening to it and thinking, yeah. But suddenly during the 90s, there was a period when I was working with Chris Hughes a lot. Chris produced Dancehall Days, and I was working with Chris on producing another band, actually, and playing a bit of guitar for him. And he played Kind of Blue, Miles's sort of seminal late 50s album. And suddenly, as it has done for many people who were found jazz a bit of a problem, suddenly the light went on, you know, and I just found it fascinating, you know, and fascinating for the composition, really. I think with music, it's always composition that's interesting. That's a posh word for like sort of songwriting and all the stuff that you do, but it's just how the music works, you know, how it ticks, how you balance it, how you take your listener on a journey with you and stuff. And I really got that Miles had simplified things to an amazing extent, and that really impressed me, because I think I'm very prone to be complicated, as you can probably tell. So Miles was a great lesson, you know. And then the variety of music that he did during his career, you know, from what one might call straight bebop in the 50s to a more complex thing in the 60s, and then into his electronic period, not electronic, but electric rock kind of influence. And that's the thing that really interested me, and what kind of powers my band in the UK, the Jack Hughes and the Quartet.
So between the quartet and your solo output, you have Primitive in 2020. You released Electroacoustic Works in 2021. You say that sometimes the music just comes to you, but there's a pretty big break between solo albums for you, and then just all of a sudden lots of material coming out now. Was there something that kind of triggered that in you?
Yeah, I think it was really just personal stuff, really. Essentially, my wife passed away in 2014. That was, to say the least, a big deal, you know. And then I suppose the journey that I was on after that was a whole new world, in a sense. And a lot of stuff that happened I found quite difficult, really, you know. And I think Primitive is the sort of, in a sense, a release around all of that kind of stuff, you know. So there's a strong theme of loss, I think, in Primitive, you know. With Electroacoustic Works, I think there was still more material to get out, but I think that was a little more of a sort of celebration of the liberation of so essentially being on my own, really, you know. And I mean that in a sort of spiritual way, in a sense, you know. Obviously, I have lots of friends, lots of people around me, and I have my children as well. You know, it's not like I'm alone in any kind of physical sense, you know. But I think it was just, I had the time. I think that was the big thing, you know, time, and especially Electroacoustic Works came out of the pandemic, where I was really just at home all the time, you know. So I thought, rather than just frittering the time away, I'd, you know, do another album. And so that really is kind of exploring all kinds of quite far out fringes of the music I'm interested in. So it ranges from a track called Sheep, which is just like acoustic guitar and voice, which I wrote literally within a half an hour after I'd gone out for a bike ride and bumped into all these sheep, through to the second side, where I attempt to do a kind of, you know, like one of the albums that has always been with me is Pink Floyd's Medal, and side 2, Echoes, I think is such an incredible piece of extended rock music. And I've always wanted to try and do something like that. So the side 2 of Electroacoustic Works, and that's when you're listening to the vinyl. So side 2 is an attempt to do a continuous piece, you know, that sort of uses the same themes all the time.
Now, I read that you actually put together a solo album in 1992 that was never released. Is that true?
Yeah, that is true. Yeah, yeah. So when WANG CHUNG split up, Nick and I both signed to different labels and did solo records. And Nick made an album with his friend John Moss, who used to be in Culture Club, and was still, I don't think he is anymore, but until fairly recently was in Culture Club. And they made an album under the name Promised Land, and I did an album on my own, you know. But it hit all sorts of political problems and stuff that I just didn't deal with at the time, really, you know. It's, yeah, it's an album that maybe I'll release at some point, but to go back to that place is almost a bit painful in a way. And also, I think I'm definitely an artist who's interested in the next thing I'm going to do rather than something I did 40 years ago or whatever it is.
Have you ever used any of the music from that particular solo album in future releases?
No, I haven't. No, I haven't. So it's all still intact, And certainly there's some good things. I think it's of its time. I think, with the demise of Wang Chung, a lot of that was about the transition out of the 80s into the 90s, out of 80s pop into sort of grunge and hip hop. Essentially, those were the two directions you could take. And the album I made was sort of really a prog album in a sense. So it was completely out of step, even more out of step than Wang Chung had become. So it wasn't the time for it really. But I will turn my attention to it at some point.
And though in the 90s there was the demise of Wang Chung, you guys are going strong today. You're currently on the Lost 80s live tour. You're doing West Coast dates as we speak. This is sort of an annual thing for you guys, right?
It has been, yeah. I sort of come to it and step away from it periodically, but yeah, I did it last year, and I'm doing it this year, and it's good for the soul in a sense. I think during the 80s. I found playing live quite uphill, stressful, and I guess I was quite tough on myself about the kind of quality that I wanted from the band, But these days, I'm not saying I'm not tough on myself anymore, but I'm more relaxed about the whole thing, and I enjoy the interaction with the audience and the spontaneity of live playing, and that's an important ingredient, really, in my sort of writing, which I see as the central area of what I do, But I really enjoy the live playing. And Lost 80s is a great way to connect with the Wang Chung audience from the past.
And this is sort of it's a stacked card, so to speak, as far as bands. There's a lot of bands on this tour, and they kind of rotate in and out, kind of like yourself from year to year. So, I mean, does that kind of get chaotic trying to orchestrate all these bands into one night?
There are a lot of bands, in my opinion, too many bands, but then I would think that because, I want to play a 40-minute set, I'm not a 20-minute set, But having said that, the variety I think is kind of cool for the audience. They sort of accept that. You obviously increase the spread of the people that you attract by having more bands. I think that's the thinking behind it, And I think it's important not to get too serious. For me to get too serious about the whole thing, it's a celebration of what people loved about 80s music, and although we have on occasions played new stuff, just dropped a new thing in there, and we have Space Junk was a track we released in 97, I think it was, that subsequently got used in The Walking Dead and became a popular Wang Chung track. So there's all sorts of people who come out to see us. I do notice when I say connecting with Wang Chung fans from the past, obviously that's a sort of core support that we've had for many years. But I do notice there are lots of younger people there as well, and that Wang Chung is connecting at all sorts of different levels through TV usage of our music and movie usage, and also adverts, and a whole sort of consciousness of Wang Chung in the culture. So it attracts a big variety of people, which is I'm very grateful for that.
Have you two explored doing just like a Wang Chung headlining show where you could play more of your music and do bigger sets?
We're looking at that, yeah. Next year, we hope to release this long-awaited reissue series of all the albums. So there are 6 studio albums. So we want to release those in sort of deluxe editions with, because at the time there were outtakes and songs that didn't get on the albums and stuff that's never been heard. So we want to release that. And we're probably going to prelude the whole thing with a new greatest hits package, which will have obviously the hits, but also some more obscure pieces from this upcoming retrospective. And so that's something we're going to do next year. And to support that, it would be great to do some headlining tours, or at least to do some gigs with some fewer bands, and more focused on the sort of wider catalogue that we can do. Which isn't to say that we won't be doing some Lost 80s stuff as well next year, because it's a good way of reaching a lot of people.
Absolutely. So I'm guessing this reissue campaign is in alignment with your 40th anniversary of your first album on Geffen Records, right?
Well, that will tie in nicely, won't it? Yeah, yeah. So no doubt, lots of advertising. We'll be talking about 40th anniversary. But it's hard to believe that it is 40 years ago that we were, well, 40 years ago we were in Abbey Road Studio 2 finishing that album off. We deliberately chose Abbey Road Studio 2, obviously because of the Beatles connection. But yes, 40th anniversary is mind-boggling.
You mentioned that you recorded in Abbey Road Studios. Any other particular memories about kind of putting this album together and sort of the reception that it received? Points on the Curve is the name of the album.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, it's very vivid, the memories of Abbey Road. The studio was, in those days, still much like it was when the Beatles had used it and Pink Floyd had used it for Dark Side of the Moon, which Nick and I listened to recently with a friend of ours in I think it was in Denver. This guy had this amazing Dolby Atmos thing, and we sat and blasted ourselves with Dark Side of the Moon for an afternoon. It was absolutely amazing. But yeah, so the studio, as much as it was, the desk that the Beatles recorded all their stuff, the old tube desk, had been replaced when they made Abbey Road with a sort of transistor desk. But it's a very characteristic bit of kit. And we recorded Points on the Curve using that desk. And I sort of remember all sorts of things about it, good and bad. I mean, it's a vast space. And I think, Points on the Curve was recorded largely using a sort of multi-track sort of method, by which I mean that we did all our parts separately and then brought it together on the tape, as it were, in the mix, So I can remember doing vocals in that room, and so you're standing in this like aircraft hangar, essentially, and the control room is on the second floor, and so you can't really see anybody, you just sort of see shapes moving around in space, So I'd sort of do a couple of vocal takes and then you wait for the tape to rewind, which you never have to do anymore because of computers, expecting them to say, yeah, it sounds great, or something. You wouldn't really hear anything. And then I'd say, so how is it? And they go, yeah, great. And you could hear laughter and stuff in the background. They're all having a great time. And there's this, I think in those days, there was this sense of like singers, and they need to warm up. And, around about take 10, 11, 12, we start getting the good stuff. Whereas I know now, and that singers do their best takes on take one, and everything else is sort of downhill from there. So it was a fairly sort of exhausting process, and I'm not sure that it really got the best out of us in terms of, certainly in terms of spontaneity. But having said that, the 80s was a different thing, and it was all about making perfect pop records rather than spontaneous pop records. It was a sort of reaction, in a sense, to the 70s, where it was all kind of like playing in the studio. The 80s was much more about crafting the music, and because it was the arrival of computers really in the recording process. At that stage, it was the LN1 drum machine and the Fairlight and stuff like that. But nevertheless, for the first time, you were working with computer tracks and the precision that they bring to the whole process, which is a mix of great and not so great.
So in that respect, as Wang Chung discussed, writing and recording new music, I know it seems kind of passé where, music industry isn't the way that it used to be, but it's been about 10 years since your last studio album, Taser Up.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, Nick and I talk about it. Nick's got a whole load of songs that he wants to record and stuff. So, it's, I guess the question, when we made Taser Up, we asked the question, what is a Wang Chung album in the 21st century? And we decided it was drum machines, synthesizers, and guitars. And so we sort of made it like that, didn't stray out of that, didn't use orchestral instruments, didn't use real drums and stuff. As to making the next Wang Chung album, I think we've yet to agree on quite what that would be. And I think because Nick and I are both writing quite a lot of stuff in our own realms, coming together, we'd have to make some adjustments. But yeah, it's not out of the question, that's for sure.
You guys are going to be heading out next year on the cruise. Have you guys ever played one of these multi-band cruises before?
Yeah, I have. Yeah, done it once before. Yeah, and it's
I assume it was a great experience.
Yeah, it is good. I was expecting it to be a little kind of chaotic, like people in your face all the time. But it wasn't like that. Actually, people are really, really respectful, and they kind of get that you want to have some time to yourself and stuff like that. But a cruise is not what I would choose as the first holiday of choice, But having said that, the opportunity comes up, so you say yes, as I tend to do to most things, and see where it takes you. In this case, round the Caribbean. So it's hard to be complaining about that.
So you've got the new single since 2017. You've got your last solo album out last year, and you've got the quartet. Are you working on anything else?
Well, another solo album is beginning to emerge. So I will get back to sort of recording more stuff and writing more stuff for that through Christmas. I think the sort of January, February time, time of hibernation, is quite a good time for me. So I imagine that I'll complete the stuff there. And I'm going to take my time a little more with this one. I think Electroacoustic Works, I sort of recorded really quickly and spontaneously and put out quickly. But this one I'll take a little more time. I think there's a couple of tracks where I would quite like to record it live. It's got a slightly more band, sort of rock band performance edge to it. So there's some slightly different approaches to the recording process, rather than me just doing it all in my front room, which I tend to do at the moment.
In that same downtime, are you going to work on new music with the quartet?
Possibly, yeah. I know the guys are really anxious to do some more shows, and I think the quartet is a lot of people I know in the pop world, and when you talk to them about jazz, they're kind of like, sure, not really, And I think the quartet is a great bridge from sort of more rock oriented things into some of the sort of, for want of a better word, some of the aesthetics of jazz, which is improvisation, really, So I think you have to get used to the fact that in jazz it ebbs and flows. Do you know what I mean? I mean, not with everything. Some of the guys are just like constantly on, But you get bits that are great, bits that are necessarily tread water especially when you're doing longer form instrumental stuff. So, but yeah, I'd love to do more quartet stuff, and that's definitely a live oriented thing. So, be trying to get more sort of gigs together in the sort of early part of next year. But I think next year is probably going to be a big Wang Chung year. So it's kind of putting aside the time for that, and maybe 25 will be back to the quartet.
Sounds good. Those are all the questions I have for you today, Jack. The new single is since 2017. It's out now on YouTube, and obviously more new music on the way. And you're currently out on tour on the Lost 80s Live Tour. And I want to thank you for taking the time to talk to me all about it.
I really appreciate the question, George, and being focused on the more recent activities. It's great. I appreciate it.
Once again, I want to thank Jack Hughes for coming on the Rock is George podcast. Be sure to check out his latest single, Since 2017, out now on his YouTube page. Head over to youtube.com/JackHuesOfficial5897 to take a listen. You can head over to your favorite music streaming app to check out Jack's other solo material, Electroacoustic Works 2020 and Primitive, as well as his work with Jack Hughes and the Quartet. Take a listen to what Jack's got out there. If you like what you hear, buy a physical copy, support the artists. For all things Jack Hughes, head to his official Facebook page /JackHuesOfficial. For all things Wang Chung, head over to their Facebook page /Wang Chung Band. I also want to thank Barbara Papageorge of RSN Entertainment for making this interview possible. You've been great. I've been George Dionne. Discover your next favorite artist on the Rock is George podcast.